this case is not going away, and that if we can get this case to the United States Supreme Court, which is where it's headed, we will win. We will win. Because every case that has gotten to the United States Supreme Court that has made these arguments that when states, the cases that ask, does a state own its intertidal land? Whenever that question has been asked at the United States Supreme Court, the answer has always been yes. The states do own their intertidal land. And so we believe that when this case gets to the United States Supreme Court, if we haven't already won the Maine Supreme Court, we believe that the answer will be yes. The state of Maine owns its intertidal land. So that's where this is going, a little preview of where I'm going to go with this slide presentation. But I see that a lot of people here have seen this before, seen this presentation before, so I'm going to truncate that a little bit and then talk a little bit about where we've been in the last year, and maybe talk a little bit about an issue that's come up that maybe you guys have some questions about, which is property taxes. So, a little bit about ground rules. When we talk about these cases and legal issues, this is a live case, so I'm happy to discuss answers and questions about history and case law. Can't get into certain facts, certain facts and certain legal arguments. That's between us and my actual clients in this case, some of which are in this room. Always assume I'm being recorded. If I am, hi mom. And hello to our opponents. This is our point of view. This is the point of view from our side of the case. I am an advocate for this point of view. Our defendants will probably see things very differently. This is not, we're all Mainers. This is not us versus them. Our opponents in this case are not space aliens. They're not bad people. They just see things differently. So this is not an us versus them. This is us versus us. This is how we see the state of Maine. This is how we see the way life should be. And obviously they see the way life should be in a very different way. That's just how it is. We see things differently. But let's talk a little bit about history. Intertidal land law goes back 2,000 years. This is not something new. So when someone says, oh, you're trying to overturn 400 years of Maine law, and actually what we say is, no, we're trying to overturn 30 years of Maine law. We're trying to overturn a case that's only 30 years old. But if you want to talk about history, what you're trying to do is overturn 2,000 years of law. Because actually intertidal land law started with this guy, Emperor Justinian. And it was Emperor Justinian who said that there are certain things that cannot be held in private hands, and that things like air. Air cannot be held in private hands. Wildlife cannot be held in private hands. Parts of the ocean, parts of the sea cannot be held in private hands. And parts of the sea that are affected by the tide cannot be held in private hands. Just last week, I gave a presentation to a group of people. Sometimes the State Department, the U.S. State Department sends people from foreign countries through the state of Maine if they want to learn about different aspects of trade in the United States. And there's a group of people coming through learning about fisheries policy here in the United States, and the State Department asked me to give a presentation to them about fisheries policy here in the United States, and specifically about intertidal land law. So I put on my blazer and I went down there and I talked to them about intertidal land law. And these are people from Madagascar and Mauritius and all kinds of places like that, and they were dumbfounded that in Maine the intertidal could be held in private hands. They couldn't believe that. And they said, this is crazy. And I said, well, how is it where you are? And this is Madagascar and Mauritius. These are Indian Ocean, former French and British colonies. And they said it's all, from high tide line out to the middle of the ocean, it's all in public hands. And I said, well, former British colonies, former French colonies, all Justinian law systems. And that's because of this guy. So not only is Maine an outlier in the United States, Maine is an outlier in the rest of the world because we have the Justinian Code in really most of the Western countries. And so we have this problem here in the state. And so when someone says you're trying to overturn 400 years of law, we're saying no, we're trying to get Maine back to the way it is in the rest of the world, not just in the rest of the country. So it all starts with our problem, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and people say, well, this is the colonial ordinance. And we say, no, the colonial ordinance was an ordinance. It was a way that we needed to encourage people to build wharves. We were starving. The colonists were starving. They didn't have the money to build their own wharves. So we needed to encourage the colonists to wharf out. And so we said, if you do that, we will give you certain private rights to build wharves, to wharf out. But we reserved the right for the public to do all the things that we needed to do with the ocean and to do with the water. So we let individuals wharf out, but we said we still need access, the public still needs access to that water so that we can survive. So we held within that, and back then in the 1600s, everything that we were using the ocean for. And back then, we weren't hanging out on the beach in the 1600s. We didn't have beach umbrellas and ping pong and frisbees. We needed the ocean to survive. And what were we using the ocean for? Fishing, fouling, and navigation. Those were the things that colonists needed to survive, and commerce. And so we never granted title to the land underneath these wharves. We never said, oh, you can own the land underneath these things. What we said is you can build a wharf, but by the way, if you do that, we still need access to this land. And it uses the word propriety, and propriety is not the same as title. If you want to get into that, Orlando discusses a lot of that in his book. The word propriety in the Old English word is a lot closer to a license as opposed to title. But here's the thing. Forget about all of the Old English interpretations and all of that stuff. The colonial ordinance was repealed in the colonies in 1686. It's irrelevant as a statute, as a statutory law. All the colonies were consolidated under King James II, and it never remained statutory law in Massachusetts. And it was never part of Maine law when Maine became a state. And even if it was, it was repeatedly repudiated by the Maine legislature. So the colonial ordinance, it uses the word ordinance as if it was some kind of a statutory law, as if there was a legislature that held up their hands and said, we vote this in as a law. It's not an ordinance. It never was an ordinance. It never was a statute. And even if it was repealed multiple times. And in fact, it was repeatedly repudiated by the people that we elected in our democratically elected legislature over and over and over again. Most recently in 1975. And then it was repudiated again in 1981. We have passed statute after statute saying that Maine owns its own intertidal land. So the people that we elected through a democratic process have said, we own our intertidal land. And the courts again and again have said, no, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. So why, if it's not an ordinance, and if it's been repudiated by the people that we elected in our democratic legislature, why does it keep coming up? Well, it keeps coming up because it's in our case law. And I use the Beetlejuice analogy here is because it seems to go dormant for about 20 or 40 years, and then some lawyers resurrect it. And I'm glad to see many people here close to my own age, because I put this reference up for young law students that don't get it. So I say, they'll say Beetlejuice, 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 and it pops out of nowhere, and they'll say colonial ordinance, colonial ordinance, colonial ordinance, and the colonial ordinance appears in case law. The lawyers get clever when they come up with title cases, and they'll go, oh, I know. We'll argue that the colonial ordinance affects this property case somewhere, and they'll bring it up, and they'll go, aha, the colonial ordinance comes up, and that's what happens. So, for example, in the 1820s, nobody was thinking about the beaches. Nobody was thinking about recreating on the beaches. Well, then we started, we came up with a middle class, and people started becoming wealthy, and we started building railroads up into Maine. Somebody got clever and started selling beach houses and beach resorts here in Wells. And we realized, hey, we could sell some of these beachfront properties, and then we came up with a colonial ordinance. Lawyers got clever and they started selling beachfront properties here, and they realized, hey, we got this thing called a colonial ordinance, and we'll do some litigation, and we'll sell land all the way down to the low tide line. That'll allow us to kick the riffraff off of these beaches, and we can sell these beachfront properties for a little bit more money. And they do that, they make some money, and then it kind of goes dormant for a little while, and then there's a little bit more litigation that happens, 40 years down the road, and the colonial ordinance comes back again. And that kind of happens throughout history. It goes active for a little while, and it goes dormant. It goes active for a little while, and goes dormant. And you can actually trace deeds. If you look through the history of deeds, you'll see that the deeds will mention, oh, by the way, this property goes all the way down to the low tide line. And then you'll follow the deeds, and then it stops mentioning the low tide line, and then there will be a big famous case that mentions the colonial ordinance, and then it'll come back again. Oh yeah, by the way, this goes to the low tide line, and then the low tide line will disappear from the mention of the deeds, and that's what happened in 1989 in the Moody Beach cases. Somebody dusted off the colonial ordinance, and it came back again. So in this case, the Moody Beach case, it was always considered to be a public beach. It was never considered, owned by one person or another, but it was always considered, hey, this is just a beach where you can go and hang out and walk around. It was never considered that the people whose houses were in front of the beach owned the beach. In fact, an entire neighborhood, houses owned by many people in this room, was built up behind the beach. And you know that because these houses existed. So you would never say, hey, I'm going to build a house out on this spit of land, 3 miles from Route 1, if you'd never build a house there unless it was assumed that you could access the beach. And that's really one of our primary arguments in this case. So there's no bathrooms, there's no parking, but there are these public rights of way. And one of the things that came up, or one of the genesis of the original case, was that the inland motels began busing customers to these right of ways and then leaving them there. And there were no bathrooms, and there was very little services. And so that led to a lot of complaints and a lot of issues, which led to lawsuits. But it started off with a lawsuit over just like, hey, we have this municipal management problem, and what are we going to do about it? And then it became a lawsuit, and then we dusted off the colonial ordinance, which became, we now own the beach, or the shorefront owners said, we now own the beach. So it became a legal strategy more than it was about ownership over the